Hey guys, History Speaks here. This video is going to be the first in the series Discrediting Holocaust Denial memes, and it relates to the meme you see on the screen repeated by Eric Stryker. Namely that, and I'm quoting him directly here, only people viciously tortured at Nuremberg or taken before Israeli kangaroo courts like Eichmann ever confessed to the Holocaust. In the first place, it should be observed that this meme and other claims about Nuremberg and torture are basically attempts at gish galloping. Because the idea is to get you to spend half an hour explaining why the Nuremberg trials weren't a fraud, and then the denier has moved on to some other issue. It's nihilistic methodology, obviously, on their part. But the appropriate response is as follows. One does not need to justify Nuremberg to reject this denier meme, because the premise underlying it, that all perpetrator confessions were coerced or given in the course of trials where people have an incentive to plead guilty, perhaps to get a lighter sentence, that's a false, just utterly false misstatement of fact. Many perpetrators of the Holocaust, including central figures, confessed to their crimes outside of trial in voluntary, non-coercive conversations or even private writings. So, and what is the evidence of this? Consider as Exhibit A, Gustav Wagner. Wagner was the deputy commandant at Sobibor, and he was sentenced to death in Germany in absentia, but escaped to Brazil. This was obviously after the war when he escaped to Brazil. And he was located by the Germans and the Israelis in Brazil in 1978, but Brazil refused his extradition request. So he was safe in Brazil for the rest of his life. In 1979, however, Wagner, again, while protected from extradition, he gave a detailed interview to the BBC in which he acknowledged what he did at Sobibor. And here's a short excerpt. "I didn't think it was right. One saw these people exterminated who were really innocent, but there was nothing I could do. The maxim was the Führer's orders must be carried out." So, look, if Wagner had been caught by the Germans or the Israelis, he would have been in a coercive situation, sure. But he wasn't coerced into giving an interview to the fucking BBC. How, Holocaust denier world, can we explain why Wagner would voluntarily give this interview lying that the Jews were exterminated? So why would he do this? And the answer is it's not plausible. Maybe Wagner was crazy, we could say, but how were all these other people crazy in the exact same way? And who were all these other people? Well, let's look at Exhibit B. And Exhibit B is Haj Amin al-Husseini, you see him pictured, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and Nazi collaborator. Al-Husseini spent the war in Berlin, but because he was utilized by the Germans to create propaganda in an effort to incite the Arab world against the Allies in North Africa and the Levant. Those obviously were sensitive areas because they were theaters of war. And these propaganda efforts, which were largely unsuccessful and based on these notions that Himmler and Hitler had of a ideological affinity with Islam and Nazism, these efforts are covered in a couple good books, one by David Monadel, the better book, one by Jeffrey Herf, who's a great scholar but is very biased against Arabs. He's got some great documentation there, but it's not a balanced work, certainly. Anyway, though, al-Husseini was a close confidant of Himmler's. He spent the war in Berlin, as I say. He also met with Hitler, famously. And he created a Muslim division, helped create, rather, a Muslim division of the Waffen-SS. So that was a notable thing he did. Al-Husseini never faced any persecution or prosecution for his wartime collaborations with the Nazis. He returned to the Arab world after the war and was safe from extradition in Lebanon, where he wrote his memoirs. But in those memoirs, al-Husseini wrote that he was well aware of the exterminations of the Jews. In fact, he was personally briefed by Himmler on this matter, according to his memoir. And he was a Holocaust collaborator because he lobbied, even after he knew about what was happening to the Jews, he lobbied to prevent their immigration to Palestine and their deportation to German extermination camps. So he was, whatever his reasons were presumably to prevent Zionism and demographic change, which hurt the Palestinians. Nevertheless, he was complicit in the exterminations in this, insofar as this prevention of immigration is concerned. So, again, with the Grand Mufti, our Exhibit B, we have a confession given with no coercion in a fucking memoir, which he voluntarily wrote, that, yeah, I knew about it, and this is a confession from someone who was complicit too. Okay, so Exhibit C is out of Eichmann. In Eichmann's private papers, Stryker mentions Eichmann about, oh, he was coerced in his trial by the Israelis or whatever. But Eichmann wrote and talked about the Holocaust long before he went to Israel. He was captured and kidnapped and went to Israel. He wrote explicitly that Hitler has ordered the extermination of the Jews, as you can see on the screen. In point of fact, David Irving, if you're not willing to take my word for it, David Irving found many of the Eichmann papers and has reported this. He had this statement. We actually put the quote from Irving on the screen. Irving has reported that, yes, the Eichmann private papers from Argentina, not from Israel, contain this admission. Now, why would he lie in a private conversations and with like Germans and Nazi sympathizers in Argentina and in a private journal? It just is absurd. All these people are lying to destroy their own reputation, so they're all crazy in the exact same way. Makes no sense. So with Eichmann, as with El Husseini, as with Gustav Wagner, we had confessions with no coercion, confessions of knowledge and complicity in the Holocaust. Now our last exhibit for far more of these non-coercive confessions, but our last one for this video will be Albert Speer, who famously was Hitler's Minister of Armaments during the war, tried at Nuremberg and slipped the noose by claiming he didn't know about the final solution, although he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for his use of slave labor, predominantly Slavs. Something, again, the neo-Nazis are fine with it. Slavs were enslaved during the war by the Nazis, but that's another point. But anyway, Speer publicly always denied having known about the Holocaust. However, in a private letter to a Belgian resistor, he admitted he had been present at the Posen speeches by Himmler, these famous speeches in which Himmler, most historians think he was trying to kind of implicate and make as co-conspirators many higher-up Nazis by talking in very explicit detail about how the Jews are being killed. And as Speer says in this letter, he was present when Himmler said all the Jews would be killed. So, we have a confession, private conversation, no coercion, of knowledge and complicity in the Holocaust. In fact, it even contradicted his public persona, where he tried to claim ignorance of the Holocaust. So those are 4 exhibits, and far more can be provided. It'd be rather tedious, but if Stryker says, oh, that's the only 4, I'm happy to provide far more in a subsequent video. But here's the real question. How do we explain these and so many other non-coercive confessions? Imagine, I've made this point before, imagine you were falsely accused of monstrous crimes, say like murdering children. Perhaps you could imagine confessing to such crimes if you were tortured or threatened or coerced in some way. Maybe you could even imagine, I couldn't personally imagine this, maybe you could imagine falsely confessing to horrible crimes to get a lighter prison sentence, to plead guilty when you're innocent. That does happen. But could you imagine confessing to horrific, reputationally destroying, monstrous crimes that you didn't commit in a private journal, a private letter, a private conversation, a diary or a memoir, in an interview you voluntarily chose to give? It doesn't even begin to make sense. But Stryker's need to misrepresent the historical record in this regard is quite sensical. Because the existence of so many Holocaust perpetrators, prominent ones like Eichmann and Speer, confessing to their crimes voluntarily with no coercion, is another embarrassing problem for the revisionist or denier thesis.